Chapter 2. Elizabeth Bennet rose as Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy entered the sitting room at the parsonage. She had known they were arriving and had expected them to call as was proper, but she had thought she would feel indifferent when it happened. However, that was not to be. Her heart had skittered and thumped when her cousin had announced that the gentlemen were approaching the parsonage, and now, upon their arrival, Elizabeth's eyes took in the smiling, though not entirely handsome countenance of Colonel Fitzwilliam, but it was a polite formality. Who she really wished to see was his cousin, Mr. Darcy. Her breath caught upon seeing him, and for once Elizabeth was thankful for the constant chatter of her cousin, Mr. Collins, for it afforded her a moment to collect herself. Mr. Darcy was as handsome and compelling as he had always been. He remained now, as he was the latest time they had met, an enigma. She had still not deciphered his character, and it was something which drew her curiosity. She had heard it both criticised and commended, but she had yet to decide which tale held the most weight. Certain aspects of Mr. Darcy's demeanour, as well as the slighting comment he had uttered at their first meeting, swayed her toward believing the worst of the man. But one of the sources of approbation, her sister Jane, caused Elizabeth to pause briefly in her judgment. Though she was nearly certain that Mr. Darcy was simply an arrogant man, with little interest or feelings for those beneath him in status, she could not discount her sister's words. "Miss Elizabeth," Darcy bowed as he greeted her. "I trust your family is well." He followed his cousin's suit and took a seat near her. "The ones I left at Longbourn were in good spirits and health when I departed." She smiled as she said it, studying his face to see if it gave any indication of his knowing that not all her sisters were at Longbourn, but it did not. His brows furrowed in concern, and he seemed genuinely perplexed. "Is not all your family at Longbourn?" He rubbed his hands on his thighs and willed himself to relax. She was as beautiful as he remembered, and her smile was enchanting. Elizabeth shook her head. "Jane has been in London with my aunt and uncle for nearly 3 months now." Darcy's brows rose, and his eyes widened. In London for 3 months? There was no doubting that the gentleman in front of her did not know of Jane's stay in town. "You did not hear she had called on Mr. Bingley's sisters?" Darcy's heart dropped to his stomach. He had hoped to discern Jane's feelings for his friend, but he had not expected to be given such a ready example of her regard straight away. He shook his head. "Miss Bingley made no mention of it, to either myself or Mr. Bingley." He fidgeted with his sleeve. "Is your sister well?" "She is not ill," Elizabeth replied with a tight smile. Jane's heart was broken, but her body was well. Darcy tipped his head and looked very seriously at Elizabeth. And her spirits? The question was barely more than a whisper. Richard saw the small quiver of Elizabeth's lip and the dampness in her eyes. The separation of Bingley from her sister had caused pain, a great deal of it, if he were reading things correctly. "Improving," said Elizabeth. "I wish I would have known she was in town," Darcy murmured. Richard nearly groaned aloud at the look of incredulity Darcy's comment elicited from Elizabeth. This battle would not be easily won. "You would have called on her? In Gracechurch Street? My relations are not among your equals." There was a sharpness to her tone. Mr. Collins rattled the cup of tea he was about to hand to Mr. Darcy. "Do you mean to say they are in trade?" Richard inserted as he saw Darcy recoil, as if he had been slapped. Elizabeth swallowed and her cheeks coloured slightly. She had forgotten she had an audience. "My uncle is in trade," she said, smoothing her skirt. "Much like Bingley's father was," Richard continued. He doubted that Elizabeth had thought her statement through, and he suspected he was correct when he saw her eyes widen just slightly. "Yes, just so, but not so wealthy. I do not mean to say they are poor, but Mr. Bingley's fortune is substantial, and therefore sets him apart," she explained. "The nouveau riche," said Richard with a shrug. "The world is changing. Napoleon, and those before him, have seen to that." He raised a brow and scowled slightly. "Not to mention the Americans," he added. "We must change with the times," said Darcy. "And yes, I would have called," he added, "since I'm not in town, and cannot do my duty in calling on a friend. Perhaps I could send Mr. Bingley in my stead? Would you allow me to inform him?" Elizabeth could not believe what she was hearing. Mr. Darcy wanted to inform Mr. Bingley of Jane's presence in town. Was Mr. Darcy innocent of the charge she had laid at his feet, of separating Jane from Mr. Bingley? Seeing a friend might lift your sister's spirits, might it not? Asked Richard, when no reply seemed forthcoming from Elizabeth. Oh, indeed. A call from a friend is always just the thing to lift anyone's spirits, said Mr. Collins. And to have a call from someone, such as the friend of one such as Mr. Darcy in such a place in town, is not something at which to scoff. I am certain my cousin Jane knows her place and would feel the importance of such a call. Richard saw Darcy's face darken. Mr. Collins was obviously a fool, and Richard knew how little tolerance Darcy had for fools. So Richard smiled and replied before Darcy could. I am relieved to know that Miss Bennet is a woman of sense. There are far too many nonsensical people in this world. There most certainly are, agreed Mr. Collins, and so began a lengthy commentary on what was and was not deemed foolish, according to Mr. Collins. For the others could scarcely insert a word with the multitude that fell from the parson's lips. Richard could tell by the twitch of Miss Elizabeth's lips and the twinkle in her eye that the absurdity of her cousin's speech was not lost on her. Finding it challenging to listen to Mr. Collins, Richard began to make a mental assessment of the situation. Miss Elizabeth Bennet had been drawn to look at Darcy, almost immediately upon his arrival. There was interest there. However, she seemed to have a poor opinion of Darcy's character. Such a thing was not entirely unexpected. Darcy's reserve often led people to believe he was proud. That would need some attention. Then there was the issue of the injured sister. He would allow Darcy to attempt to smooth that over. Miss Elizabeth had seemed startled into silence at the mention of a repair being made, so the breach did not appear to be insurmountable. At a rare pause in Mr. Collins' commentary, Richard followed Mrs. Collins' lead and chuckled at whatever it was that her husband had said. Miss Elizabeth's face shone with amusement. The lady possessed a sharp tongue and a keen wit. Darcy would not tire of such a woman, as he did of the ladies of the ton, who had a limited ability to enter into debate. Richard suspected that Miss Elizabeth would not shy away from a debate. This was good. He took a sip of his tea, satisfied with all the qualities he had observed in Miss Elizabeth. She was, as his aunt had declared, just the sort of lady Darcy should marry, and added to all these recommendations was the fact that she was compellingly pretty, and she affected his cousin in a way he had not heretofore seen. Darcy was uncomfortable around most ladies, but he did not dry his hands on his trousers or tug at his sleeves and cravat as he did in Miss Elizabeth's presence. The battle might not be easily won, but it would be a victory worth the effort. Richard turned his attention back to the conversation at hand, just as Mrs. Collins was interrupting her husband, before he could venture off onto another topic which none but he cared to discuss. I trust your journey was good, Charlotte said, looking first at Darcy and then Richard. Oh yes, how foolish of me not to remember to inquire, said Mr. Collins. It is one of the many benefits of having a sensible bride. He took Charlotte's hand. I tend to ramble, you know, but Mrs. Collins always knows how to bring me back to the point. I would highly recommend finding such a wife. Thank you, my dear, Charlotte replied, as a hint of colour added a bit of charm to her features. How a sensible woman, such as Mrs. Collins appeared to be, had ended up with such a husband as Mr. Collins and was able to seemingly enjoy his praise was beyond Richard's comprehension. But it could not be denied that there had been at least a few small looks and smiles shared between the two. They seemed genuinely content, if not happy. Our journey was without event, said Darcy. It was quite pleasant, even if I had to endure it with one so silent as my cousin, said Richard. It would do Miss Elizabeth good to see Darcy being teased. I was not silent, protested Darcy. No, not silent, but not talkative either. It was a prod, to get Darcy to engage in a bit of banter. Darcy's eyes narrowed and he shook his head. There was not silence enough for me to enter more than a few words. Richard shrugged, pleased with the startled look the comment had drawn from Elizabeth. Yes, indeed. She needed to discover the less formal side of his cousin's character. I do have a tendency to expound on many things. Darcy chuckled. No truer words have ever been spoken. Elizabeth tilted her head and studied the man seated to her left. She had never heard him chuckle, or even appear to be slightly amused, and such a spectacle must be observed carefully. for she was not certain when it might happen again. "And what sort of topics interest you, Colonel Fitzwilliam?" Elizabeth asked. "Himself," muttered Darcy, his lips curling up in a hint of a smirk. "I am of great interest," Richard agreed with aplomb, "but my father supplies a good deal of material, as do my brother and his children. He has two, an heir and an almost spare." "An almost spare?" asked Maria, Mrs. Collins's younger sister, who was also staying at the parsonage. Richard nodded. "She is a second child, but she's not a son and cannot inherit the title, so Millicent is the almost spare." "That is horrid," said Maria, with all the indignation a lady of 16 could muster. "I do not make the rules for inheritance," replied Richard. "My brother and his wife were so certain that their second child was to be a boy, that when Millie was born, and not a boy, the moniker just seemed appropriate." He winked. "She is only 2, so the name does not bother her in the least. Her father is not so complacent, however, and it is for his sake that I use it." "I still think it horrid," protested Maria. "As does my sister," said Darcy. "Georgiana is forever scolding Richard for saying it, but in my cousin's defence he never uses it in Millicent's presence. It is truly only a phrase to torment the Viscount." "Then I should like Miss Darcy quite well for rendering such a service on behalf of her little cousin." Maria's chin lifted as she said it, and Mr. Collins cleared his throat uneasily. "I think you would like Georgiana regardless of her scolding of me," said Richard. "She's a shy girl, but sincere and loyal, traits that run true in our family. One such as yourself could not go wrong in befriending her." "Miss Darcy has a tender heart, it would seem," said Charlotte. "Yes," replied Darcy. "Georgiana possesses a very affectionate heart." Elizabeth's brows furrowed slightly. This description did not match that of Mr. Wickham's. Wickham had claimed Miss Darcy was proud and cold, but then she was currently being described by her relations, and there must be some allowance for prejudice. It was only natural and proper. Richard checked his watch. Miss Elizabeth was looking confused enough that it might be best to take their leave, while she was still feeling unsettled. "It has been a pleasure," he said as he snapped the cover closed over his watch, "and I am given to understand that you will be joining us for dinner." "Oh, indeed," said Mr. Collins. "Lady Catherine is very gracious in her attentions." "I am certain she is," Richard said as he stood to take his leave. He had no desire to hear the man launch into an exaltation of Lady Catherine's finer qualities. "If you would be so kind as to give me your uncle's address for Mr. Bingley's knowledge," said Darcy, as he followed his cousin's lead and stood. Elizabeth blinked. He truly did mean to send Mr. Bingley to call on Jane. "Of course, if you will give me a moment, I shall write it out for you." "We shall await you outside," said Richard, moving to the door and giving Darcy no choice but to follow, which he did. They had been in the front garden no more than 5 minutes listening to Mr. Collins elaborate on the flowers, when Elizabeth, thankfully, appeared, and they were free to return to Rosings, Darcy to write his letter to Bingley, and the Colonel to consult with his aunt.